Occasionally I'll commit to making something and I'm not really sure I can pull it off. This may not be the wisest way to run a business, but it does push me outside my comfort zone. But pushing yourself to try new things and new techniques is how you get better at anything. And this is definitely a project that pushed me to try new things. Two years ago, a friend hired me to build this bar for him. The build video link's in the upper right hand corner. Since finishing the bar, I've done a few other jobs for him, but there's still one thing in the space left that needs to be replaced. My friend really wanted to get rid of those white plywood shelves and make a little broom cupboard for the trash can to go in, so I came up with this design. I've never made a curved cabinet before, so I watched a couple videos on YouTube to get an idea of what the process would look like. I opted to go with a laminated approach over something like steam bending. This necessitated making quite a few forms and having a vacuum press handy. Probably half the time spent on this project was just making forms. This was really a situation where I wanted to spend as much time as possible making sure everything was right and prevent the finished product from coming out all wonky. I ended up making two different forms for the cabinet itself. One of them was used to make the upper and lower parts of the face frame as well as parts of the cabinet doors, and a slightly larger one was used to make the toe kick or baseboard piece. This piece I'm cutting right now is the bottom part of one of the forms. Because these are going to end up inside a vacuum bag, I need to add air channels for the air to be sucked out by the vacuum pump. The vacuum press will end up running at about 25 psi when all is said and done, so these need to be fairly sturdy. Each form was covered in 3 layers of 1/8 inch thick hardboard that I used wood glue to attach. Putting the tops on these forms was somewhat of a dress rehearsal for what making the final pieces would be like. I made this one here with just 1 layer at first and then added the second 2 after another vacuum press. This really wasn't necessary, but I was kind of learning what I was doing at the time. That mesh stuff that's at the top of the form is just that grippy stuff that you put in drawers to keep things from sliding around. This is to allow air movement on top of the form, just like those grooves on the bottom. There are actual purpose-made products to do this that you can get from veneer supply companies, but they're a little pricey, and for what I needed to do, this was a cheap and effective solution. So for the record, right here I'm using Titebond 2, which is a polyvinyl acetate glue. This is fine for the forms, but you wouldn't want to do it for the final pieces. I'll be showing a different kind of glue in a little while. The reason you wouldn't want to use Titebond or something like it is because even at full cure, it's still just a little bit flexible. For a lamination, you want something that'll dry rock hard. I covered the forms in contact paper because when I actually do this for the final go, it's going to be messy and I didn't want to have the glue get all over and stick to the form. I only filmed a little bit of the resaw and drum sanding, but there was a lot of this for this project. I went through probably about 25 board feet of walnut, making these thin slices that'll end up the final curved pieces. I drum sanded everything to only 80 grit because for the type of glue I'm going to use, you actually need a fairly rough surface. I sanded everything until my laminations would end up at exactly 3/4 of an inch thick. For the laminations, I used a pre-catalyzed glue called UltraCat. To use this stuff, you just mix the powder with water. It takes quite a bit of mixing and at least over 60 degrees to cure. 90 degrees is better. I used an ink brayer to get as even of a spread as possible on each piece. This is the type of glue that's used to make skateboards, so you can imagine how strong it is. There's some continuity errors in this sequence here because I went through this 3 separate times and I didn't get perfect footage every time, so this is kind of just a conglomeration of all of it. This was totally unintentional, but having those grid lines for the contact paper that I used on top of the form was really helpful to make sure I had a nice curve and not something twisted. This is an example of why I was glad I had that experience making the forms in the vacuum bag. Until enough air had been sucked out, I needed to hold my laminations down to prevent the bag from getting sucked between them and the form. After I was sure the glue was fully cured, I opened up the bag. What I ended up with was a perfectly curved piece of walnut that was way stronger than the original wood ever had been. I neglected to mention this earlier, but as I made these laminations, I was very careful to keep the grain orientation all correct or try to match the colors as much as possible so that they would come out looking like actual solid pieces of wood. After I knew I had successfully made the curved pieces, I went ahead and started making the cabinet carcass. This was mostly made with pre-finished maple plywood, and I attached it all together with pocket screws. I made two of these quarter-round pieces. One of them was to serve as the upper structural top to the cabinet, and the second one was to be used to cut these curved pieces properly. Since none of this was ever going to be visible, I went ahead and used pocket screws again. Originally, I made this piece thinking it would serve as the bottom, but it ended up being much more useful to do this. It worked really well to get the arc angle correct. The two vertical pieces to the face frame were some of the only unlaminated pieces of solid wood in the entire cabinet. I went with dominoes to hold the face frame together. Cutting the flat vertical parts was easy enough, but I had to be a little creative to get the dominoes properly aligned on the curves. I used a variety of different glues on this project, and in this instance I used Titebond 3 because I wanted a longer open time to be able to work with everything. I did not have an effective way to clamp these pieces together, at least not readily, so I decided the best thing to do would be to just install the entire face frame on the cabinet and then use ratchet straps. I get this question in like every single video where this is displayed. This type of gray corner clamp that you see at the top here is made by Wolfcraft. You can get them on Amazon and they look a lot better than they actually are. Because I planned on doing inset doors instead of overlay, I needed to add some sort of stop for the doors. Because these were already going to be attached to the laminated curves, I decided Titebond 3 would be good enough. I wanted to use Euro style soft close hinges for the doors, and to make sure that the hinge geometry was correct, I had to make these little pedestals. This was the least sketchy way I could come up with to properly cut these angles. I didn't really want to put the saw stop break feature to the test, so I did it this way to get a nice clean face cut onto this piece. By making these pieces, I was able to make sure the hinge base would be properly aligned and be as close to 90 degrees to the curving door as possible. I did dress them up with some counterbore holes and curved corners. The baseboard toe kick piece was too tall to be able to cut the same way as I did the shorter ones, so I had to resort to hand tools on this. This was probably the quickest and best way to do it anyway. I added a 15-degree bevel to the top of the toe kick to match what was on the existing bar. I used dominoes to attach some straight end pieces to finish the toe kick off. These were glued on and then attached to the cabinet much in the same way that the face frame was. For the doors I had to make another form. I already had the horizontal curves that I made previously, but now I needed to make the vertical parts. Initially, I had planned for the vertical parts to be a lot longer than they ended up actually needing to be, and subsequently the form was too big for my vacuum bag. However, it didn't really matter that I couldn't use the vacuum press on this portion because the vertical parts of the doors were so narrow that I was able to do everything with clamps. Like the previous forms that I made, this one was topped with 3 layers of 1/8 inch thick hardboard. You truly never can have enough clamps. The process of cutting, sanding, and gluing these laminations together was the same as what I showed earlier, except this time I was able to use 2x4s to achieve the curve. Well, a 2x4 that I cut in half anyway. The way I planned this out in my head was going to require cutting each of the vertical pieces in half right down the middle. To make it as accurate and safe as possible, this is what I came up with. I didn't want to try and rip the curved lamination in half on the table saw without using some kind of support for a few reasons. One, being made from rough cut lumber, the sides weren't perfectly straight yet. And for my other reasons, I didn't want to try and cut it on the crown of the board because it would rock around, and I didn't want to flip it out around the other way because I didn't want the two pieces to fall in on the blade once the cut was complete. But as you can see, my solution worked pretty well. Once I had a good straight reference edge, I was able to rip the other side off. With the 4 vertical pieces cut, I chopped the top and bottom curves in half to make up both sides of the doors. The door panels themselves are going to be held in from the rear, so I needed to cut some rabbets to fit them in. Having the panels float inside a groove would have probably been the best way to do this, but to be honest, making these doors was a huge challenge and I was having a hard time wrapping my head around everything, so this is how I chose to do it. And one of the other big reasons I chose to do it this way is because then I was able to domino the vertical and horizontal pieces together. After I had glued the door frames together, I still needed to chisel out the corners for the panel recess. With that out of the way, it seemed like a good time to drill out the hinge holes. Here you can see why I needed to create those blocks for the hinges to attach to in the earlier part of the video. Once the doors were fitted, I was able to fine-tune the shaping of the curves. At this point, I still really wasn't too sure of how I was going to make the door panels, so I decided I'd better get on that. I used a hardboard core and I cut some more veneers out of walnut. The panel needed to hold a slight curve, so I had to make one more form, but I did that one off camera. It was pretty similar to the last one I showed. Initially, I only put veneer on the front side of the panel, but I found that after a few days the curve started to come out, so I added another piece to the back. When doing veneer, there's kind of a rule that if you have a really thin core, you put a piece of veneer on one side, you need to put a piece on the back as well to counteract the forces. I fine-tuned the fit a little bit with a block plane. After veneering the other side of the panel, I had to come up with some way to hold it into the door frame, so I 3D printed these little clips. I'll be the first to admit that this isn't the most elegant solution to the problem, but they worked well. With the doors done, I needed to make the top. I screwed up while filming and did 2 of these shots in slow motion, which is why they look so weird. Anyway, I closely cut a piece of plywood and then used a flush trim bit to make it the exact same shape as the top of the cabinet. Due to the size of this panel and the directions I wanted the grain to go, I had concerns about wood movement. So I decided that veneering the plywood with some of the slices of walnut that I had that were too thin for the laminations would be the most safe and economical solution. When it was all said and done, these pieces of walnut ended up less than a 1/16 of an inch thick, so I didn't have a whole lot of concerns about expansion or contraction at that point. The panels for the top of this cabinet ended up a little bit bigger than what I could fit in my vacuum bag, so I had to rely on mass and gravity for the clamping pressure. After veneering the panels, I needed to wrap the raw plywood edges that would be visible. I started by gluing and nailing an 1/8 inch thick walnut slat to the curved side. I did it this way to make a nice wide surface for my laminations to glue to. This was tricky enough as it was, and by having that first piece already glued and nailed to the plywood, it went a lot smoother than I think it would have gone otherwise. After everything had dried, I needed to cut the top side of the curve flush. Before using the router, I decided to remove as much of the excess as possible with the oscillating tool. I figured this was sketchy enough as it was, and I wanted to remove as much excess as possible before getting the router out. Once I had a flat reference side, I was able to trim the other on the table saw. I added some roundovers and then turned my attention to the back panels. After all the veneers and laminations, it was really nice to just work with solid wood. I used the same shaker style rail and style bit set that I had used on the bar so everything would match. This would have been the ideal way to make the cabinet doors, but trying to do it on a router table would have been pretty dangerous. All the videos I saw on making curved doors showed people using spindle shapers and pretty complex holding fixtures. And I definitely don't have room for something like a spindle shaper at the moment. Off camera, I had veneered some more walnut to some scrap pieces of 1/4 inch thick hardboard for the panels. Because these panels would be held flat by their frames, I wasn't too worried about them warping without having the back veneered as well. I used dominoes to secure the joint for the 2 panels. I probably could have used dominoes to secure the top and bottom together as well, but I planned on doing all the finishing before I assembled it, so I decided to go with pocket holes. Once the finishing was complete, I really didn't want to mess around with too much glue. This part then sits on top of the cabinet, but it also gets secured from the inside with screws. Finishing was done with what ended up being 7 coats of Osmo Polyex oil. This is a hard wax oil finish, and although it takes a lot of coats to get a decent shine, putting it on is very easy. Once finishing was done, I put everything back together. And then I added one final touch. The install went really smooth. A few screws were used to secure the cabinet to the wall studs. I think it looks about 1,000 times better than the old white plywood shelves, and plus the unsightly trash can is now hidden behind the curved doors. This cabinet ended up being one of the most challenging projects I've made to date, and I'm thrilled with how it turned out. If you're still here, I hope you enjoyed the process of making this, and as always, thanks for watching.